Welcome back, everybody. I am Greg Davis, and welcome back to the D3 Energy live stream. I am your host, Greg Davis, and I wanted to continue the discussion today about oil and gas and where it comes from. And then I'm going to tell you how we find it, who finds it, the great oil finders, and the resurgence of conventional oil and gas. So think of the earth as a living and breathing organism, like a human being. But human beings live for 80, 90, 70, 100 years, and we evolve pretty quickly. The earth is about 6 billion years old, yet the earth, while we can't see it, evolves and changes slowly over time. It can take tens of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, billions of years. So way back when the earth was very young, billions of years ago, there was a lot more water on the earth. But imagine it's like a beach that you would go to, say, in California or in Florida. And when you go to that beach, you see the beach and you see the water and the sand kind of goes out. And then if you go out a little bit farther, you will see reefs. And then you may even see a river that winds its way and dumps off into the water. Well, the earth was like that millions and millions, hundreds of millions of years ago. And beaches formed and coral reefs formed and rivers came and made their way and dumped out sand into the shallow seas. Well, water is full of life, organic life. And oil is created when all these little organisms, plankton column that we know about today, but these organisms that are hundreds of millions of years ago, they were in the water and they died and they settled to the bottom, and they settled in these beach formations, in these sort of deltaic formations where the sand from the rivers come and dump out into the ocean and create these deltas. And then they have these reefs, and all reefs are is all these little organic critters. It's the little skeletal remains of these organisms. So, and when all this stuff is buried under sediment and rock and shale and pushed into the ground, heat and pressure convert all those little organisms, those little bugs, into oil. And what happens is oil, when it's down in the earth, it migrates. You know, they say oil floats on water. If you pour some olive oil on some water, you'll see the little drops floating, like when you're making spaghetti and you put a little olive oil in. Anyway, so oil floats on water, and oil wants to migrate and find its way. Well, what oil did, what all this oil did that was created from all these decomposing critters, it migrated into traps. And it's these traps that are deep in the earth that we want to find. And that is where all the great oil fields in the world today and in the United States is in these conventional traps. Now, who finds this oil and gas? Well, you may or may not have heard of geologists and geophysicists. And let me explain. A geologist is just like a doctor who understands the anatomy of the earth. A doctor understands the anatomy of the human body. A geologist understands the anatomy of the earth. And a doctor will sometimes consult with a radiologist. And what does a radiologist do? A radiologist will look at an X-ray or an ultrasound of a person's body and interpret that. Well, the geophysicist is the radiologist. So great oil finding teams comprise a great geologist and a great geophysicist. Much like great doctors and great medical teams are comprised of great doctors, a great radiologist, and some other people who will help along the way. Well, I have had the great pleasure over the years to work with some of the great oil finding teams, these great medical teams, who know how to interpret the body of the earth and to look inside and look at the history and look at the facts and look at the data and look for places that the oil and gas migrated to and pooled up in. And that is conventional oil and gas. It is really these great oil finders. And I have, again, had this great pleasure of working with a lot of these guys. And oil finding is really an art. It is an art, it's a science, it's instinct, it's interpretation, and then it's making a decision on where to drill. Just like that doctor decides where to cut or where to treat or where not to. So with the rush of the shale boom, when the oil companies all left these conventional reservoirs, these regions where we had these reservoirs, and went to these shale and what we call kind of crummy rock areas where the oil formed, trapped, and never moved, they left behind these areas. And I've said this yesterday, and I can't reiterate this enough. Conventional oil and gas is coming back, but it's going to be found with these great oil finders. I learned this from a very early age. My father was hugely successful having the great oil finders. I was very fortunate. That was a phone call. These great oil finders, and I've got those guys on my team, and there's many out there. And conventional is making a resurgence, and it's going to happen with these great oil finders who know how to interpret the earth and who know where to go. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. I thank you for joining me, and tomorrow we'll pick back up. I'll talk a little bit more about conventional versus unconventional, and then I will talk about the resurgence that is happening and give you a little sense of how big this resource is that is remaining. The oil resources, and then the great resources that is in the mines of these great oil finders. Thank you for joining me today.